I would now like to introduce Jewelle Gomez. She is a playwright, novelist, and poet. She's the author of 8 books, including the first Black lesbian vampire novel, The Gilda Stories, which has been in print more than 25 years and was recently optioned by Cheryl Dunn to develop as a television miniseries. Her essays, poetry, and short fiction have been published in more than 100 anthologies, including Dark Matter, a century of speculative fiction by African Americans, and the recent Amazing Stories anthology, No Police Equals No Police. Her trilogy of plays, Words and Music, explores the mythology of African American artists in the first half of the 20th century and has been produced in San Francisco and New York City. So we are excited to have Jewelle here, and Jewelle, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valerie, and welcome to everyone who's here for the presentation. I'll tell everybody I'm experimenting with doing a slideshow while I'm talking. So if I get a little discombobulated, hang with me, it'll all work out. I decided I wanted to show you some pictures because I'm talking about myself and what it was like growing up and figuring out I was going to write sci-fi. So I wanted to share some of the images of things that meant a lot to me. First, I want to say I'm coming to you from Oakland, which is Ohlone land. And I'm grateful that we're on it. So I'll start by saying that the previous 4 years, and certainly the last year of COVID, have been some of the most horrendous times in my lifetime. And I want to send out sympathy to those of you who've lost family or friends to the pandemic. It has been very, very hard for all of us. And I know it's hard to stay inside and stay safe, but please continue to do that. The last 4 years put me in mind very much of the 1960s in the social unrest that was in response to a lot of bloodshed. Dr. King was killed, JFK was killed, Robert Kennedy was killed, along with a lot of young activists who went south to help Black voters register and then lost their lives. And if you recall the thousands of young people who lost their lives in Vietnam, a kind of a pointless war. And those of you who have not seen The Trial of the Chicago 7, the new film, you really should, because it gives you a very deep understanding of the horrific way that authorities can try to squash our civil rights. And it's a great lead up to understanding about civil actions and the importance of what Black Lives Matters was able to accomplish over the summer. But one of the things that was important for me at that time, that all of the demonstrations, all of the, even the violence, but the demonstrations in reaction to the violence always left me with an underlying feeling of hope. We still felt like we could change things in our lifetime. And one of the things that demonstrators always chanted was, the whole world is watching. The whole world is watching. As police were beating demonstrators, as authorities were doing impossible things, that was one of the great chants. And one of the sad things right now is that feeling that maybe the world is watching, but as we're watching, we're seeing government officials raising their hands in salute and solidarity to neo-Nazis. We're watching government officials turn back the efforts to end the pandemic it doesn't seem like that sense of hope is able to be sustained. And bringing up all of these things may seem like an odd beginning for here at Rainbow Magic, but I really want to talk about what led me to speculative fiction through my life of activism and social consciousness. And I'll use the phrase speculative fiction to cover everything: fantasy, horror, sci-fi, vampires, anything under that umbrella. And I'm also going to use the word queer to represent all of our initials. So when I sit down to write, I'm hoping to recapture that sense of hope that drove many of us into activism in the 60s. It was hope that sent Dr. King into the streets. It was hope that sent queer people out to fight the police and then to march every year. It was hope that sent Alice Paul to jail and to send her on a hunger strike so that where she was force-fed in an effort to get women to get the right to vote in 1919. And hope sent a lot of people out into the world to fight for civil rights, people of all ethnicities and class backgrounds. And ultimately, what I want us to think about is what is it that makes us important? What is it that makes us as important as any politician, as any movement activist, as any frontline worker? What makes us important in this expansive universe? What, as humans, makes us valuable here? And I would say it's hope. So I'm trying to, there. This is the title of my talk, and I'm taking advantage of the Rainbow Space Magic logo, which I thought was so gorgeous. I'm a lesbian feminist of color, which means that, and of a certain age, as you can tell. So that means that everything that I have to say, all of my observations are rooted in that experience. And so you may not share that exact experience with me, but we are all humans on this planet. We are mostly queer, and we have a passion for speculative fiction. And as we know, when you're writing or when you're reading, it is the specifics that engage you, whether it's Darth Vader in Star Wars or Ripley in Alien. It's their specific interior life that keeps us coming back for more of their story. Stephen King, he writes a book every year, I think, maybe even every day. And if anyone knows if I can get a blood transfusion from him so that I can step up my game, I would love that. But he was one of the first people to engage me as a reader when I was in college. I read Carrie, which is about an adolescent girl tortured both at home by her religious mother and at school by the jealous and callous schoolmates. And when she finally comes to her power, it rises up in her. It meant I could feel it rising in me. The same with The Green Mile. In The Green Mile, I don't know how many people have read, that's not one of his most popular, but he put it out as a serial novel. That means he put it out in 6 small books that really were several chapters at a time. And so you could only buy them when they came out. And it was about an inmate who is kind of like a magical realist representation of the fury any of us might feel because of the sadism of those in power. And at the same time, he's a specific Black man who's been done wrong, just like we read about in the newspapers today. And this book was really very powerful and unusual. He went back to something that used to be done in Victorian times, putting the book out in separate chapters. And I had a really funny experience. I was in the airport. I can't even remember where I was going, but I was reading one of the books, like, I don't know, chapter 4. And there was a guy sitting across from me in the airport in one of the other chairs reading chapter 5. And we kind of caught each other's eye, and but didn't say anything. He was a white guy, probably in his mid-50s, dressed like a three-piece suit businessman. I obviously don't look like that. And then when we got ready to get on the plane, he said, "What do you think?" I said, "It's brilliant. I can't wait." So we got on the plane. We were not seated in the same area. I think he was in first class. And about 20 minutes into this flight, a flight attendant came to me and said, "Excuse me, are you reading Stephen King?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "This guy in first class sent you this book." And he clearly finished chapter 5, so he sent it back to me. And I thought, this is one of the powers of books. You never know who's going to be reading and loving the same thing that you are. And Stephen King bound us together because of his power of storytelling. But it wasn't until later that I began to think about what speculative fiction would mean to me. It wasn't until I started trying to look at some of the research I was doing for my novel. But one of the first things that I thought about was something that Audre Lorde said. Audre was a Black lesbian feminist activist and poet. And she said, "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." And I understood that others' fantasies about who we are as people of color, as queers, or whatever individuals we are, in order to fight off their own fear, people created fantasies about us because they had fear of some kind of difference. And their fantasies were a way they used to contain us in a manageable box. Our speculative fiction writing, I think, helps dispel their definition of us. Another important element that has been guiding me since I started writing speculative fiction is an aspect of the philosophy of the surrealist. And probably the surrealist you most are familiar with, Salvador Dali's This Wild Painting, film by Luis Buñuel, in which a woman appears to have her eyeball slashed in half by a razor blade. But the surrealists had a real popularity in the 30s, and their point was to write and paint things that didn't adhere to a bourgeois norm. The female surrealists that I loved were Lenore Carrington and Frida Kahlo, even though people don't usually associate Frida Kahlo with the surrealists. But it was hard to work in the genre with surrealists, most of whom were men. But I will say that there was an important philosophy that the surrealists handed down that has guided me always through my speculative fiction writing. And that is, the surrealists believe in order to change the world, you must first change your dreams. And for me, as a lesbian feminist, I understood that my writing would be a way to imagine the world a different place. It was my way of dreaming. And even though until recently, most of the speculative fiction was written by white straight men who portrayed women as decoration, I really thought it was the place for me. Now, these are some of the covers from a magazine and a novel. These were pulp covers. And this was typically how I would see what I would see if I went into the store to buy a science fiction book. Not the most engaging. I mean, almost all of them have half-clad women on the cover. And it's not that I am against half-clad women. I believe we should have the power to take off our clothes if we want to. But if that's the only thing you see, it really does not feel that welcoming. One of the most popular books in the 60s came out in 1961. Probably most of you have heard of it as Stranger in a Strange Land. You know, do you grok this? That's where that word came from. Everybody, when I was in college, thought that was the best book in the world. It was supposed to be life-changing. And then I read it, and I just thought it was recycled patriarchy. It just seemed to be using, quote unquote, free love as an excuse for men to have their way with women and not feel bad. It did not impress me particularly, and I was very disappointed. Still wanting to have my hand in science fiction. 4 short years later, Frank Herbert published Dune, and it really offered a fuller perspective. I don't recommend any of the movies made. There's 2 movies about it so far. Maybe a new one will come and be better. But the thing about Dune that was most significant to me was the Bene Gesserit. And that was a group of powerful women who trained their bodies and minds so that they could have superhuman powers. And their goal was to be able to direct humanity into an enlightened path. They were ruthless and chilly, as this picture might let you know. I wanted to be one when I read that novel. They were so powerful to me, and it was the first time I had seen something in which the female characters really, for me, dominated the story. Outside of books, I, of course, watched a lot of television. My great-grandmother and I actually watched a lot of Star Trek, and that was fortunate for me because the creators of Star Trek and Twilight Zone both had an internalized sense of ideals. They really had some maybe just liberal social ideals, but they were different from a lot of the other writers and producers of television at that time. And so their ideals weren't necessarily as complex or sophisticated as ours. And there certainly was no obvious queerness, although fan fiction was very wet with queerness. But their sense of social justice portrayed in the things on television really gave me a sense of the possibilities. Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, refused to have in any of the subsequent Star Treks any queer characters, but he did accomplish one thing. He was able to portray the first interracial kiss on television. You all probably all heard about this. But I thought it was very clever what he decided to do to get past TV censors. He created a plot in which the 2 characters, the captain and Lieutenant Uhura, were being controlled physically by aliens, forcing them to kiss so that the censors would try to overlook it. But even with that, the southern states banned that episode. The other show was Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. It was one of the most amazing shows for me because, again, he was someone with a social conscience. And one of the most significant shows on of the many was a show called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And it talks about shows how a neighborhood deteriorates into chaos and murder just because the neighbors all fear something is coming to get them. You know, the street lights start flashing, ominous shadows are appearing in the leafy little town, and electrical blackouts. And so everybody gets paranoid and decides that something is coming to get them. Well, what is in fact happening is that some aliens are up above manipulating all of the electronics just as an example to show how quickly Earthlings can turn against each other. And I think that's something we could think about when we look at the tapes from January 6th in the Capitol. The coda to Rod Serling's episode is: the tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs, explosions, and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, and prejudices to be found only in the minds of men. Prejudices can kill. Think QAnon. Twilight Zone was so effective that Jordan Peele, who did Get Out, which was a groundbreaking Black horror film, has his own show now called Twilight Zone. When I started writing the Gilda stories, Joanna Russ was one of the women coming through the women's liberation movement who was very popular as a speculative fiction writer. There were, of course, many others, Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, James Tiptree Jr., who was also Alice Sheldon. But Joanna Russ was the person who first grabbed my eye, and I understood that I could be a feminist and a lesbian and out, as Joanna Russ was. Then I read Octavia Butler's Kindred. That was her first book. And it made me know that speculative fiction that I, as a woman of color, could land on. Octavia Butler is having a resurgence right now. There's an opera being created by Toshi Reagan, who's a lesbian feminist musician and singer. And a couple of other films are in the works of her books. I did, of course, read Dracula and Interview with a Vampire, and I did a lot of historical research, but I was very clear this was not what I was going to write as a vampire story. I really wanted something that reflected my lesbian feminism. And I wanted to understand what Joanna Russ gave as an example in her work of how genre fiction can use small personal stories and deliver valuable principles, universal ideas, and morals, and still be engaging and not feel cheap. So the Gilda story starts in a really small universe, a young girl who's never been beyond the boundaries of the plantation where she's a slave. But when her mother, the plantation cook, dies, she escapes, taking a leap into the equivalent of outer space, and is chased by those I think of figuratively speaking as aliens, that is, the slave catchers. And the book really is a coming of age story, but it just happens to take 200 years. It starts in 1850 and goes through 2050. And at the beginning, Gilda is rescued by two benevolent lesbian vampires. And as I wrote the full novel, I had to think about what did I want Gilda to say to people. And despite what some of you might think, having some principles behind your writing doesn't impede you as much as it gives you something higher to work for. And I thought a lot about what I wanted Gilda to say to readers, and when I adapted it for the stage. And I realized that the underlying principles for Gilda, and I think for probably most of my writing, are a value of family, whether it's biological or logical, as Amistad Mopass says, a connection to community, whether it's mortal or immortal, is really crucial. And the idea that power requires responsibility, which is the opposite, basically, of what capitalism teaches you. But those are the principles I wanted to base my story on. And the story did pass the Bechdel test, even before there was a Bechdel test. And the Bechdel test, for usually used for movies, means that two women talk to each other about something other than a man, that the main character is a woman, but not a victim. And I also, for me, she's also a vampire, but she didn't victimize others. Her goal was to take blood and leave something behind, like a sense of power, some kind of investment in life. And her goal, I think, is to combat those things that we think of as unwelcoming, as culturally, combat our fear of not what's unwelcoming or what's culturally alien. Like many lesbians of the 90s, I watched Xena Warrior Princess for any hint of a love affair between her and her faithful friend, Gabrielle. And when I met her in Sydney, I was too shy to ask what she thought was supposed to be going on between them. But it was interesting that the one real kiss between Xena and Gabrielle happened, I think, underwater, because they were trying to save, one was saving the other. So it was kind of like they camouflaged it, like the Star Trek kiss. When I watched Doctor Who, I found that the worlds were much more expansive, but still much more expansive than Stranger in a Strange Land, but still narrow, still lagging behind the actual world. And it wasn't until they introduced Bill, Bill Potts, she was a companion to number 12, who was an out lesbian and actually has a lesbian lover in the early part of her tenure. And I was so excited to actually to see that, to see an African-American lesbian featured in Doctor Who, since I was such a big fan. And then when they decided to have a female Doctor Who, I thought, this is really the possibility of imagining a new world, not just sticking with the old. However, I'm afraid that many people wish that we did stick with the old. If you think about Ghostbusters, which I saw the original and had fun, and then when the new Ghostbusters came out with the all-female cast, Kate McKinnon, Leslie Jones, Christine Wiig, and Melissa McCarthy, the internet went berserk. It was as if we had personally murdered Bill Murray. All of those young guys, and it is still mostly guys who see science fiction movies, all those young guys were now grown up and they really hated that women would want to make the film. And they hated it so much that they're now making another Ghostbusters and ignoring the fact that these four women, one of whom is a lesbian, Kate McKinnon, that really rankled them badly. So they're not even going to reference that there was another Ghostbusters. In 1994, I attended I was part of a Black Writers and Speculative Fiction conference in Clark Atlanta University. And in that weekend, Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, who are now legends, were there. Also, Stephen Barnes, who's a novelist and a screenwriter, and Tanana Reeve Dew were there. And she was just having her first speculative fiction novel published, of The Between, and she subsequently has published many more books, including an Africa Immortal series. The title of this particular presentation came from something that Stephen Barnes said at that meeting. Quote, a lot of philosophy, a lot of myth making and storytelling has to do with what was the shape of your face before your parents were born. What lies beyond the edge of your existence? And when your mind starts going beyond the questions of your little trivial life and death, you start asking yourself, what is it you want to leave afterward? At the same conference, Octavia Butler talked about what it means to be human. That is a tiny being on a big world and a huge universe whose time is running down. Using the formation of the Hawaiian Islands as an example, Octavia Butler said, here the earth is losing some of its heat as it spews out lava, but it is creating these islands that are beautiful, that people want to live on. And that's what we're doing. As we live, we're creating things. And when we die, we leave them behind for other people. And for me, that's about as significant as any of us can hope for, ultimately. As we look around at what we've lived through, what we've read or we've seen, it is more than obvious that things have changed and developed, and as well as obvious that needs to be more change. Alien was a really significant movie for me because I was so excited to see a hero, a female hero in space. And she wasn't just, the captain of the ship. She was physical, she was tough. It was so exciting to me. I saw it, and then my mother and my grandmother came to visit me in New York. I took them back to see it because it was so exciting to me. They loved it. But I was so thrilled at that moment. I came out to them when we were in the bathroom after the movie. I came out to them. I felt so empowered. They were great. The people coming into the bathroom behind us were a little puzzled, but I decided anything is a teachable moment. From that moment of thrill to this one, many years passed, but it was a similar kind of thrill. This time, people in Oakland dressed up in African garb and stood outside of the remaining movie palace in our area for hours waiting to get in. And it was like we were at a party even before we saw the film. And part of the reason for me that it was so thrilling was not just we had the marvelous star who played Black Panther, sadly gone too early, but we had the Dora Milaje. Again, for women, for lesbians, it's really important to see ourselves in powerful positions. And this film held up the cultural aspects of African heritage and bonded with the principles of community and family, as well as embracing scientific discoveries and aspirations. Did not include any queer elements, but who can resist the Dora Milaje? This next film, The Old Guard, I don't know how many people have seen it, but it was one of the most extraordinary films I saw in 2020. And one of the things well, there are a couple of things. One, it was directed by an African-American woman. It stars an interracial cast, and it features a gay male interethnic couple who are among this gang of immortals who right wrongs around the world. Charlize Theron and Kiki Lane have a warrior's battle when they have to connect with each other to make sure that they can trust each other. And it was one of the most spectacular hand-to-hand combats I've seen between two women, without weapons. I looked for pictures of the gay male couple, and they're very explicitly gay and male and very, very sensitive and tender with each other. But clearly the PR office for this film did not put out a lot of pictures of them together. But it was very, very moving to see a gay couple portrayed in the battalion of heroes saving the world. And I am focusing mostly on women because I'm a lesbian. But we do know that there are lots of queer Black male science fiction writers, like the ever popular Samuel Delany. There's a new book, a relatively new book by Marlon James called Black Leopard, Red Wolf that I just recently bought. It's a great adventure. There's a Black gay writer, Kai Ashante Wilson, has a book called Taste of Honey. I haven't read it yet. And between all of them, you'll get demigods and mercenaries, and they're all very well muscled. Transgender writers, of course, are breaking through more and more. We've got Poppy Z. Bright, who's always popular. But more recently, a writer, Charlie Jane Anders, who has lived in the Bay Area, has written a lot of criticism, literary criticism, and fiction for young adults. And she has received both a Nebula and Locus Awards for her fiction. These are some of the women who are writing now. Unlike when I was writing, today we can find a bigger variety of speculative fiction writers and speculative fiction writers of color. Tanana Reeve-Dew, who was at that conference I mentioned earlier, Nalo Hopkinson, Niti Shaw, M.K. Jemison. All of these are writers. I'm going to go with at least two of them are lesbians. They're writers who are breaking through all of the barriers that I met when I thought about writing the Gilda stories. They start off with a much bigger field because they understand and are accepted in a much better way than I was at that time. So it means I have a lot more things to read, and it's really, really thrilling. And I value being able to read work by all kinds of writers, people who look like me, people who don't look like me. In addition to these writers, something really extraordinary happened for me about 2 or 3 years ago. I was at a conference for Golden Crown Literary Society, has an annual conference. I was at the conference and I went into the seller's room, and I was walking by one of the tables, and I had to go backwards because I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but I couldn't believe that I actually saw it. And this was what I saw. Black lesbian feminist press. You could have knocked me over. Since Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, I hadn't even imagined that I would ever see those 4 words put together. It was extraordinary to me, almost made me cry. But I did back up, and there were some Black women proudly displaying the banner. their press and their titles, and I stopped to talk to them and have not stopped talking to them since. These are 3 speculative fiction, 2 collections of poetry, 2 Moons and God's Will and Other Lies, and an anthology, Black to the Future. Black lesbians are everywhere. And in 2021, 21st century, that we actually have the renaissance of a Black lesbian feminist press is pretty amazing, and not something to be taken for granted. People need to buy their books so that they survive. And one of the reasons that it exists is because of this woman. I know, Stephanie, you're out there and you're thinking, oh my God, why am I having your picture up? Well, it's because I love you and I love your book of stories. And I love what you have done with the press. Stephanie Andrea Allen's collection, speculative fiction collection, is How to Dispatch a Human, Stories and Suggestions. Just the title alone will tell you how witty and clever she is. And it's really heartfelt to me to go from years of watching mindless women decorating the covers of men's books to a selection of fulfilling Black women characters, Black lesbians who address all of the issues that we as humans have to think about. And her book talks about artificial intelligence. Is it just a convenience or is it a threat? As outsiders ourselves, how do we react to other outsiders? What is our role in social change around the world? I contributed a story to an anthology called No Police, No Future. And it was brand new, and it was put together by the folks that used to do Amazing Stories. And they wanted to do an anthology of stories about alternative futures of alternative justice. So I thought, oh, what will that be? That seems hard. And the editor who edited the anthology, James Beeman, he says in the book, I write what ifs because, well, what if I didn't? And I thought, okay, I can do that. So I tried to think about, well, what if there were no police? And you go back to the runaway slave patrol, who were like the people who captured my main character when she escaped from slavery. And police since that time have pretty much emulated that kind of personality. The anthology is in response to the Black Lives Matter defund police call, and wanted to get speculative fiction writers to really think about, well, what is it would happen if we defunded the police? Those of us who've been historically victimized by police, from my character Gilda to anyone who had an encounter with the modern police force, understands that it's really not easy to re-envision what police would do. The riots at Compton's cafeteria, which came just before the Stonewall riots, these are places where we as queer people they tried to beat us into the ground. How could we reimagine who they would be as servants of the people? What I decided to do was to think about, instead of them being these guys, the one is the Bloody Sunday in Montgomery. Instead of them being these guys, I had to go back to the Surrealists. In order to change the world, we have to first change our dreams. And speculative fiction writing is that changed dream for me. So I decided to think about, what is it that we need? We don't need slave catchers. We don't need riot gear. We need people who are fully rounded, who care about what they're doing and care about the people they're meant to protect, and who actually see the people as people. And so what I did was think about, what other institution could I transplant into the future that might take the place of the police. And so I settled on the Peace Corps, and tried to recreate the Peace Corps in the US, to have each community have a Peace Corps, and the lesbian who's telling this story is about to start her first day on duty at the police corps. And one of the first things that the Corps does, it doesn't hold up officers as a solid monolithic thing. So when you go into the Corps, one day you might be chasing purse snatchers down the street. The next week, you might be helping people in your neighborhood look for jobs. Or you might be helping someone who's got an errant child that they would like to learn a little bit better in school. So that once again, the purpose is to break down policing into things that keep the police human and keep the police seeing others as human. That was really hard to come up with, but it was really fun to do that. And it made me think about, as a lesbian and a person of color, I've always felt that I have the capability, if I allow myself, to look in from the margins and see what's bigger and see how things might be different. We can, like Stephen Barnes said, look beyond our very small and short-term thinking about things around us, even the things that we can't see. If we can look beyond them, we can excel. In our journey on this tiny planet, the great cosmos, we each carry a story of who we are that we're meant to share with others. And in sharing who we are, we can see even better who we are and help others have hope. I went back to the top, but it was really meant to go here. I have this great picture I want to share with you. There. I really feel like we all have great stories to tell. If we can imagine the world as a better place, our stories will get even better. The significance of what we leave behind is all about what we can imagine, how we can change our dreams and imagine things to be better. Writing for me, writing speculative fiction, is dreaming different futures and dreaming better. And what I hope to leave behind is hope.
All right. Thank you, Jewelle. Thank you very much.
You.
We are near the end of our hour. So I really want to thank Jewelle. This was an amazing talk. I learned a whole lot. And you are coming back on Sunday to do a reading and a Q&A?
I am.
And so we will put some of the questions that people had today, they can take them to you there.
Yes. I'm sorry I went on so long. I couldn't stop once I started thinking of what did I want to talk about.
And we didn't want to stop you. And also just a plug for Stephanie Allen for the BLF Press is going to be here Sunday as well. So we encourage you all to talk to her then. So, but that's it for now. Thank you very much, Jewelle. And we're going to get set up for the next panel in a minute.
Okay, well, thank you everyone who came.